Hello. I know that this room is quite cozy, so I'm going to be quite gentle with the presentation, I guess, and maybe kind of like introduce what I do as a practitioner and kind of move through the themes that I guess relates quite well with this weekend's symposium and different practices that we're coming together with. So I guess to maybe like introduce myself, I'm Angela and I work predominantly as like a researcher, whether that's through my research-based art practice where I make art pieces as well as curatorial projects. I'm currently, for the past half year, also a policy researcher in international climate and cultural policy with the non-profit organisation Julie's Bicycle, which actually measures a lot of the carbon footprint of the UK's cultural sector. And England, because there's also Creative Scotland. Sorry. No, I'm just like I know this. I'm just presentation mode nervous. And I've been the research consultant on the report that will be published for COP. That kind of looks at how environmental policy can be implemented in cultural policy around the world, and if it's being done already or if there's any intention to do so. I personally have a lot of conflicts with a lot of these types of I guess like policy world engagements, and as a researcher I really kind of appreciate the time and space that I have in my artistic practice in order to engage with the critiques that I want to discuss about this, this other kind of like sector of work and research. And I guess like responding to this symposium, a lot of it about climate literacies makes me also think about, I guess, the notion of illiteracies. So what does it mean to give ourselves the agency or the understanding to say that we're literate in a subject matter or a type of strategy to confront the climate challenges, the political challenges of climate change, and what makes us illiterate in that respect as well. And so in a lot of my practice, throughout my practice, I engage with really trying to break down the power imbalance in the production of knowledge. So we kind of, need to start considering what qualifies as expertise and how do we deconstruct that criteria, that tick boxing that we assume for ourselves that we need in order to be finding that agency and empowerment to talk about climate issues, especially within our local communities and regionally and then nationally and internationally. So a lot of the things that I do, I guess I can show you some slides now to illustrate, so you're not just like listening to me, but also seeing things that I get up to. And so since about 2014, I've been running this website or curatorial platform called Worm Art and Ecology. And it started off as a kind of basic blog where I would interview different practitioners and artists and researchers and activists. Why are you talking about environmental and climate issues? What does this mean to you? And what kind of strategies do you feel are effective ones that work for the themes that you engage with? And it kind of built up as a curatorial project, kind of a bit on its own accord. It was I don't come from like a curatorial study. My background is art history and languages, and Worm Art and Ecology over the years also has given me the opportunity to really develop these topics through research, but also engaging with young people, which I found really motivating because we would think about largely the briefs we would work through would discuss, what does a fair, safe, healthy climate future mean to you? And so I would encourage them to use science fictional storytelling tools to work out these kinds of narratives that they hopefully can write for themselves. So a lot of the exercises and activities that we'd spend doing, I worked with, I've worked with 2 youth groups who are already associated with galleries or museums, under the kind of brief of thinking about intersectional climate justice and their own futures. So using the storytelling format, I guess, builds up a climate literacy in a way, because it's I would encourage them to start with maybe an article or a song with its lyrics, or something that they've seen on the news maybe, and ask them, okay, what's the story here? Who are the characters who are kind of identifiable throughout this story? What is the narrative or the plot line saying? And then so figuring out all of these elements of story building and world building, we can then kind of try and critique it and say, well, do you trust this narrative? Does it speak for you? And in a way that leaves it quite open for people, young people, to write their own endings if they imagine something better, something fairer. And so one of the activities, one of the youth groups, they ended up working with different cultural practitioners and activists on a panel talk that they organised themselves, and that was kind of remote because of the pandemic. And also another one, it ended up with a comic book that they had drawn themselves, imagining actually quite a pessimistic future, one that they feared a lot, so with a lot of anxiety. And so that, I guess, really tells us as people from different generations that the literacy that you hold to talk about certain things, it shouldn't be restrained to like how much lived experience or knowledge you think you have, because you already actually have enough to start discussing these impactful ideas.
Sorry.
Oh, is it? Oh, it goes on. And so in terms of like curatorial projects, I work in a way that amplifies how climate colonialism is something that is completely, parallel or like interconnected with climate change. We can't talk about the history of climate change without the history of colonialism. And so for this specific commission, I think illustrates that my intentions in a way, because it's an online journal commission with British Art Studies, which is a art history journal between Yale and the Paul Mellon Art Centre. And they asked me, oh, Angela, how do you see British art and climate change at this moment? And what are the discussions that are happening in this intersection? And for me, my instant reaction is to problematize what British arts means, and also to problematize what climate arts means, because both of these things can be very easily conflated as issues that are kind of like can be depoliticized, which is quite dangerous within the arts about nations, representations, and also the climate struggle. So for me, I thought it was really important to actually engage from a diasporic perspective. So for myself, my kind of diasporic identity is that my parents come from Hong Kong, and they moved when it was still under British rule. And I thought a lot about how, well, what does it mean for me to be a racialized person in Britain, to be talking about climate change? How does this relate to my own personal ancestral history? How does it relate to colonization that's happened in my family and my people, essentially? And so with this commission, I invited activists and artists who have this relation as diaspora, whether they were born in the UK or have moved to the UK, and continue with their activisms that are related very much with their homelands, to discuss British arts and climate change in this kind of like brief means to them. And so I encourage everyone to kind of like look at it, because it gives a good profile of what the contributors are really talking about, and I think it would be helpful for me to highlight Sonia E. Barrett, who's an artist who talks a lot about trying to be in conversation with the National Trust and talk about how the furniture that decorates the stately homes across the UK are made from the mahogany and the precious woods of the Caribbean. And she talks a lot about the slave trade and her own experience as a Black woman entering these spaces and trying to reconfigure what reparations looks like in terms of land rights across the UK, where Black people have long been part of the building up of the great empire, yet are kept from the spoils of the empire. And I think I'll kind of like move on actually, but do check it out. Climate Knowledges lasted a week before the pandemic lockdowns hit the Netherlands. This was an exhibition in Rotterdam, and I guess the title itself really speaks to like the plurality of different types of knowledges that we really should be conveying in our discussions about climate change. And so this exhibition gathered together science fiction writer as well as 3 visual artists and a grouping of locally based climate justice activists who fights very much in line with anti-colonial climate justice work and talking about how the Dutch state are continuing their neo-colonial violence against their homelands. And what we kind of like collaborated together to produce as like a climate visual cultures library was something really important to me, because I felt that people can come into an art exhibition and see visual works and researches about climate change, but what does it mean to the visitor to leave knowing where to put their own kind of like solidarity, material, financial resources to go and support local activists who've been doing this for a very long time. Actually, I'll move on to this one as well. Part of my research, which relates to the youth group work that I kind of explained just earlier, is relating to science fiction as a way to start thinking about new world kind of like imaginaries, one that actually centres justice. And so the London Science Fiction Research Community is a group that I joined as a co-director just over 1 year ago. And every year we have a kind of select theme that we follow. So for this year that you can see here, it's Beyond Borders, Empires, Bodies, Science Fiction. Last year it was on activism and resistance, and we had lovely Radha as our amazing keynote speaker for our annual conference, which we host every September. And it was just so brilliant to have you with us, because it was really important for us to have people who have been doing this work for such a long time to help us relate how storytelling, literature, and the way that we want to narrate history's presents and futures into a much more accountable and environmentally and socially responsible way. So what we want to do as a research group is merge together different creators and thinkers, and not just have it as this silo of science fiction scholars or researchers, which is quite a niche as well. So I gladly welcome you to join us every month. And then I co-founded the London Chinese Science Fiction Group, which kind of like works in a similar way. It's been going for about 2 years. The London Science Fiction Research Group community, the one before, we've been going for about 8 years now, and there's about 8 co-directors, and this one's with me and a collaborator, Guanzhou. So, extending the conversation this morning about language and the geographical kind of like differences and cultural differences of what we talk about when we relate to, political ideas and the different connotations that spring up through language. I became quite interested in Chinese science fiction, which actually over the years has become a bit of a kind of a political vehicle for the States. Actually we read through English translations, and every month we invite the authors and, if available, the translators as well, to discuss with us how they have written their stories and what kind of impacts they are hoping for, and we as readers and commentators discuss with them as well. So I actually came into science fiction not through reading, I guess, like the Western canon, which is kind of quite homogenous, I guess. I came into science fiction reading radical black writers, Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, and also just became very interested in science fiction through translation, and looked into Chinese science fiction that talk about climate issues as well. So I wrote my postgrad paper on that. And so this is something that's kind of like continuing as a bit of a side project. And so I guess like you get a brief kind of like run through of like the different like things that I get up to. And so I guess I'll try to introduce to you like my research-based art practice and how I think through all of those different tools that I use to kind of centre environmental and climate issues in my work. And actually I've been working quite a lot with water, in the sense of like the bodies of water that have been utilised by people, industrialised and I guess like colonised as a yet another tool for exploitation and for the market. And I think a lot about the water cycle itself, in the sense that it keeps, it keeps going no matter what we do to it, but at every single kind of human interaction at any stage of the water cycle, whether it's rain or the gas of clouds, or the bodies of water that fill between our lands, human interaction is eroding it abrasively or at different kind of like degrees of harm. And to think about that throughout the cycle of actually it is a repeated cycle of like climate history and colonial histories. I try to kind of think about how power struggles and water cycles in this way can merge into one unified kind of beginning of conversation. And so earlier in the summer, I was commissioned by Metal Culture to contribute to the Estuary Festival. And I actually chose the site of Wat Tyler Country Park, WAT, and this sits on the Thames Estuary, and it's now a nature reserve. You can go bird watching. There's an RSPB kind of like visitor centre there, perfect for you with your binoculars, and it got me thinking, like, okay, so this is also the former site of the Pitsea Explosives Factory. How do we enter this site as a tranquil nature, nature-giving, replenishing environment? How does it kind of make us feel, when we're in the height of a pandemic at the time, to feel like we have access to something that can be healing, when we know at the same time this has roots in colonialism and this military history that is actually ongoing. So I started to think about how a lot of our histories are actually unfinished, and we're still kind of not even reconciling, but just continuing many tangents from these unfinished histories in the present day, and to untangle them enough to move forward into a future where it's more in a public and also corporate and state consciousness that we should be anti-war. Just feels like something that's very far away, but I really hope that through research and this kind of communication, I can kind of like add to something that communicates the issues of that. And so with this negotiation of like tranquility, and also understanding that this site's brought a lot of devastations to many different areas of the world, was a starting point for Export Explode, which is a kind of 15-minute short video piece, which is like a gentle introduction to the history of the site, because it aims at an audience who actually visits the nature reserve rather than an arts audience, and that's something that I'm really happy to produce as a researcher, and to make it as hopefully accessible as possible. And so with the history, the British Explosive Syndicate, which was basically the British government and Alfred Nobel of the Nobel Prizes, who was also the inventor of the dynamite, they teamed up to have this kind of, what essentially was a startup, but then became one of the first multinationals of the modern age. They monopolized the explosives market at the time. The British government, they created a loophole through which they could deem other explosives as unsafe to use, whereas Alfred Nobel's invention of the detonator made it safer to detonate and use, but safer for whom is a question. And so they actually essentially had the entire empire as its market, and also the empire's allies, and they extracted minerals and other raw materials of stone, gold, precious materials from these lands, which is very much in line with the slave labour and into the free market imperialism that we still have, whereby corporations are extending their neocolonialism through commercial activities. So the British Explosive Syndicate, they really laid down the commercial, ideological, and also the technological frameworks to build up the explosives and arms trade as we know it today. And so with all of this in mind, how do we again come to this site in England where, these green grass of England is something that we preserve and really seek to protect, when we know that actually throughout history there are many places around the world that have been desecrated and peoples and cultures completely harmed by these activities. And I thought about a way to try to communicate this in the video piece. I thought a lot about the birds, the migratory birds that come to the site, and thinking about how, the birds have seen a lot of lands that have been damaged before, and they still come to spend their seasons at Wat Tyler Country Park, whereas on the other hand, people can't. People can't cross those borders, and so at the end of this, it's kind of like really rethinking how water has shaped this place, where the estuary itself hugs the landscape of the park and the former site. And it makes me think about, bringing it into the contemporary moment. What is peacetime? Because throughout these history textbooks and archives that I was reading, it says, in peacetime they created a lot of these explosives, and then during wartime these explosives were then taken into the battlefields. And I think that we need to remember that, when it's peacetime for us in Britain, it's definitely not peacetime elsewhere in the world. And actually, when I was making this, I thought a lot about the British government's new kind of investment in the defence sector. It's been, the largest in 30 years. It's the largest since the Cold War, and this came, after only weeks after a several months campaign to feed children in poverty through the pandemic, children who receive free school meals. So in terms of thinking about the future and resource scarcity, it kind of just it really unsettled me when I was reading the news in preparation for the project, just thinking when the government, even today, or right now, are saying that climate change is going to bring a lot of resource scarcity, we need to protect our isles from the adversaries who are going to fight for these resources, yet we don't forefront the vulnerable families who don't see, they live day by day and don't see the futures, and we can spend so much on fictioning a future that could come after war and conflict. It kind of just blows my mind. And so I think thinking about climate and conflict was something that I was beginning to kind of understand a bit more through this project. And so we come to Rain Paradox, a very colourful piece that I created and exhibited at FACT Liverpool just last month. And they commissioned me as what they called a digital fellow, which was a year-long kind of supported programme, and that really gave me a lot of space to think in depth in some of the research ideas that I've been having in my mind for a couple of years now. And so kind of continuing with water as a resource and how it relates to people, I came across this report that was published in June 2020. I'm going to skip to this one, called The Great British Rain Paradox. And so it was published by RB Finish, which is the dishwasher tablet company, the detergent company, and then supported by the Environmental Agency. And it says, it kind of reveals this paradox that says, about 77% of the 2,000 British respondents that we surveyed believe that the UK is a wet and rainy country, and therefore therefore believe that we won't have water scarcity issues as scientists project in 20 years' time. And so the report also states climate change and a growing population as factors for these projected water issues. And so what I found quite disturbing about the report actually was that it's very kind of not even citizen centric. It's kind of dealing with us, the public, as consumers, because we pay a utility bill. We're kind of considered as customers of this natural resource. And throughout the report, it teaches people how to conserve water, to be kind of more efficient with the resource. And it says actually nothing about the states and the state deregulations over the past few decades of corporations who are just not obliged to record any pollution that goes into our water. And actually in the past couple of months, there's been so much more conversation about this, which I'm really glad for. Back in, when I was thinking about this in 2020, actually a week after the Great British Rain Paradox was published, a report, I think by ENDS, was published saying that all rivers in England are polluted. And so I think a couple of months ago, they went a step further to establish that actually about 60% of those English rivers are polluted with sewage. And so this has all been kind of getting so much more attention recently, which I'm pleased about, but also angry about, I guess. And so I think with the Great British Rain Paradox, it's also a problem because it's a report supported by the government, the Environmental Agency, and it's archived on the government's website. And so I think about this as okay, in 20 years' time, in 2040, we can look back and the government themselves can reference this report and say, we told you so, we warned you, we told you to use water more effectively. And I see this as something that is kind of a shifting of accountability and something that is affecting the public framing of climate change and resource scarcity in the way that is going to impact us in the future. So timelining these stories is something that I think is really important to think about. And so as a response, I think what's important is that we archive our own stories. So, okay, 2,000 people were surveyed for this research report by RB Finish, but who were they? What were their kind of backgrounds, the climate variability across the UK, is quite great as well. So how do people differently experience daily water practices depending on the regions that they come from or live in the UK? And so my kind of like approach to it was to research with collaborators who are based around the UK, who I know as like very community orientated. They organise within their local regions quite actively, and ask them, okay, what are your daily practices? How do you feel about this, report coming out? What are your feelings about it? What are the qualitative I guess like elements of data that we can record right now, so that the hegemonic narrative of the Great British Rain Paradox isn't the only one that is archived for this period of 2020 or 2021. How can we offer counter narratives that are going to make an impact in 20 years' time when we look back? And here we have Kajol and Fatima who have a great project called Kitchen Cultures. They do a lot of community cooking in the south and in London, and they talk a lot about how water affects every kind of step of their cooking stages, and even to the extent of speaking about the history of the spice trade. Fatima and Kajol talk about the water cycle itself within the commodities and of ingredients that we use, how the dehydration means that you can stack so many different herbs and spices and then use the bodies of water around the world to transport and then rehydrate them again on this end. And also talking about spiritual and healing properties of water, which is something that makes us consider water not as just this utility commodity. And I think that's something that's really important for us to recenter away from the reports where it's saying very kind of almost clinical approaches of like you need to use your shower less. They even said in the reports that using a dishwasher is more water effective than hand washing. Things that you do kind of like question, like how is this evidenced? And then so again, thinking about the criteria of expertise, I just feel that within our chosen families, our local communities, we already have so much experience to talk about just daily practices that we should archive them. We should make a strong effort to practice self-archiving on a very kind of frequent program. And then here we have Lalu and Yasmin, who talk a lot about how water shapes Cardiff as a city. So they talk about the mercantile history of Cardiff, and how actually, especially in Butetown in Cardiff, where actually a lot of the racialised population and black population live, is the lowest part of Cardiff, which is one of the first to go when the sea levels rise. And so how this actually not only shapes the living conditions of demographics throughout the history of the city, it continues into today's racialization of certain bodies, and they talk a lot about their abolitionist work and their own practices as researchers looking into Cardiff's 1919 race riots, and how water shaping the city is something that's documented in the reports of these riots. And so they did this great research kind of Twitter account where they would live tweet on the centenary of the race riots, what was happening, who was kind of like running where, and water, the bay, is spoken about a lot. And I just think that it's really important for us, I guess, to remember that, the water, as I said, water cycle keeps going, and we're going to be held just like water, however we're going to shape the land. So we need to be really mindful of the kind of the ways we're eroding the landscape, and be mindful that water is always going to come back to us in any kind of like form that it needs to fill. If that makes yeah, makes relatable sense. And I think I'll leave it there because I do want to have space for kind of like just chatting. Now that you know a bit more about kind of like the perspectives that I come from. And I also kind of, I'm humbled to be in this space where there's a lot of people with like a lot of experience more than mine that I really want to share with. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there and chat.